Hi, everybody. Calling in from Vashon Island, the ancestral territories of the Puyallup tribe, the Shwabop's people, as well as just really glad to join everyone here and seeing a number of familiar faces. See Dave Fluharty, see Daryl Williams, see Jessica and Francesca, people I've had the privilege to work with in the past. So I guess a little bit about my background. You'll see that here, but I'm a professor at the University of Washington, the Seattle campus. And perhaps like many of you, I look at the world through lots of different lenses. I have formal training as a limnologist. I studied limnology or freshwater ecology at the University of Wisconsin. I was doing my master's degree at Michigan on conservation biology, but I had a profound experience when I was in the Peace Corps in the Philippines for 3 years. And like so many Peace Corps volunteers, it really changes your life. And I became really aware that so much of environmental governance and management is about people and how they behave. And when do people, you know, live a sustainable lifestyle, why they treat the oceans the way they do, how conservation be designed, all those things became fascinating to me. So I did that work in the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua doing participatory action research. And I was privileged to join the faculty in the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs and the Jackson School of International Studies. So I'm a bit of a hybrid, but I do describe myself as an environmental sociologist now. And I look a lot at social movements. I do a lot of work with Winona LaDuke on tribal rights. I work a lot with Puyallup Tribe and Chief Leshai schools, tribal school in just south of Vashon. And I've had also the chance to work internationally, and I continue to do a lot of work internationally. So Brad's an old friend, and when he asked me to talk to this group, I, said, sure, I'd be happy to talk to people about some of the work we do. So, all right. So engaging societies in ocean management, the essential element. And I also want to start by thanking, one of the things that's been really wonderful is I've had the chance to, work with hundreds of people on this kind of work. And I want to acknowledge their contributions to, if nothing else, to my own learning and that of my students. So I want to focus on 3 take-home messages today. But the first 2, these are the kind of take-home messages I want to try to address. We must engage in society, with society, if we want successful outcomes. Now, I know that sounds like a trope and sort of rather obvious, but we'll unpackage it a little bit what I mean when I say engage. And I mean deeply engage from an empathic perspective of different groups of people, social groups. Secondly, we need deeply interdisciplinary science and knowledge creation that are essential to ocean solutions. Now, the word I want to focus on here is deeply. I don't mean cursory. I don't also mean interdisciplinary work with a physical oceanographer working with a chemical oceanographer. I mean sociology meets art meets ecology in a profound way. I also mean different kinds of knowledge, not just science, but other kinds of knowledge that could be indigenous, as well as understandings that fisherfolk have or managers have. And then if there's time, we can talk about mechanisms by which I think this is best developed. One of which is I'm doing a lot of work on learning networks and this idea of decentering specialist information. So many times scientists like to put themselves at the center of the conversation and say, I'm the expert. I'm here to impart my knowledge upon you. And I think that that's anathema to participatory processes. It's not that science or knowledge holders don't have something to contribute, but I frequently believe that they should be in the background and provide their information when invited in a process. So those are some take-home messages. I'm going to start with a slide screen grab from a famous paper by a friend of mine, Ben Halpern, published in 2008 in a prestigious scientific journal. And what you see here is obviously the take-home message from this article published, I believe, in Science. Green or blue are areas unimpacted by humanity or less impacted. Red and yellow and oranges, especially reds, are areas where we have a heavy footprint on the oceans. And the layers in this GIS were things like overfishing and perturbation of ecosystems and water quality and the like. And the take-home message when I review this slide with my students is there is no place on the ocean where we have not had an impact. This is a controversial term, that so-called Anthropocene, but the fact of the matter is that we are living in a world where humanity is driving the bus in the oceans. And we can also see patterns in where things are heavily impacted as well. Now, I've done a lot of work, both as a practitioner as well as a person who studies so-called marine protected areas. And these are complicated spaces. Some would suggest that they have to be places where fishing is not allowed. Sometimes they allow some kind of multiple use. But this is a classic figure from 1990 by Bonsack, where basically he said, if you don't fish in an area, the fish get large, the fish swim outside the no-take area, or larvae go outside. And we spent roughly 30 years debating this. Just let that sink in. Most of the research in the 90s and early 2000s, and most of the funding for research was studying these sorts of dynamics. And in fact, I wrote articles that said, as a practitioner, as a Peace Corps volunteer who worked with the Filipino fishing community to set up a no-take area, I said, you know what? I was a boy from Wisconsin. I had seen a coral reef for like a month and learned enough about coral reefs to know that if you don't fish in an area, the fish get large and they produce babies that float outside. What was really overwhelming and complicated, though, was why do some people support these kind of areas and why do others? What are the trade-offs and the like? And that kind of questioning went unexamined for decades, partly because you're examining a tool that some people are so committed to that they didn't really want to know that there were trade-offs. They just assumed that all boats rose when you declared no-take areas. So I would suggest that this kind of slide is fairly elementary. If you don't fish, the fish go large and they swim outside. Now, if you look at the goals of marine protected areas, there's a diversity of goals: habitat protection, ecological benchmarking, protecting non-target species, ecosystem restoration. But there are also a whole number of social goals, and some of them are more sort of in the background, and some of them are very practical, like spiritual fulfillment, beauty, but also things that are very practical and meaningful to people, like economic vitality, stewardship, restoring a fishery, fostering connections to the ocean, maintaining food supplies. And in the Philippines, for example, it was about forcing their government to be accountable to the needs of local fishers. And that was actually done through community-based MPAs. Some people would suggest that that's not what's happened in some other contexts. There's also issues of empowerment. So protected areas can actually empower a community. It's a question of who's driving the bus, and sometimes pride. People feeling good about taking care of their resources and their environment. Now, as you can see, I am somewhat of an advocate for protected areas, but I'm also all about process. And frequently the protected area process, the declaration, the goals have not been equitable, they've not been inclusive, and therefore they've been contrary to my personal beliefs, not only my ethics, but my very practical side. Currently, there's these massive agendas. It started at 10% of the oceans, and it went to 20% of the oceans, and now we're at 30 by 2030. these global declarations that happen, seemingly, and now there's people saying half the ocean shouldn't be touched by fisheries. I use this only in my teachings as a fact that some people seemingly in these global agendas feel like as long as we get these declarations declared, somehow this will result in empowering processes or declarations. And I problematize that a little bit, and I suggest that sometimes these declarations, as Tundi Agardi said, can really mislead people and take people's eye off the process and the importance of process. More forcefully, people like Nathan Bennett and others. Nathan worked with me as a postdoc at the UW. He's now the head of marine sciences at the WWF for the whole world, by the way. Interesting, a geographer running the science program for WWF. Things are changing at the NGOs. He wrote a paper about ocean grabbing. And frequently people had used this term to critique the behavior of corporations, people harvesting nodules at the bottom of the ocean, offshore oil, that they're grabbing spaces that historically have been either high seas or national resources. But Nathan and others said, you know what, you can also consider conservation to be an ocean grab. You know, especially when we're talking to scales like 30% of the ocean. Who's at the table to decide these things? A group of us also then subsequently wrote what we called a appeal for a code of conduct for marine conservation. Some people really were scratching their heads about this and saying, why would you do this? We're on the right side of history. We're trying to protect the oceans in the world. Well, think about it. Doctors have to sign a code of conduct, a Hippocratic oath. Engineers have to abide by a code of conduct. Well, why not the conservation community? And this code of conduct says things like transparency is important, being frank with people and inclusive with people. Hearing out people who have to pay the price for conservation, because there is a price. It's not to critique or say conservation has no role. It's just to say maybe there should be some guardrails or some guidance. And also, again, the pragmatist to me suggests things like, if we don't take these kind of matters seriously, not only are there ethical considerations, but we're really shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of potential for success on multiple fronts, not only just biodiversity and fisheries, but also humanistic and human concerns. And I think Brad sent out a paper that, frankly, I think is one of my most cited papers. It's a couple thousand people have cited this paper, and maybe it's because it has a pithy, grabby title, Marine Protected Areas as Biological Successes and Social Failures. And basically, this paper looks at a number of MPAs in Southeast Asia that I had done work in. By the way, one of them was where I spent 3 years working with a community establishing and community-based MPAs. And we were looking at, well, the conflicts around these protected areas. Protected area declarations are always conflicted. And in this paper, one of the conclusions is, why are we continuously surprised by this? And why don't we have things in place to equitably mitigate or respond to this conflict? Also, Brad and I and Francesca and others and Terry Williams collaborated in work up at Tulalip, whereby I was asked by Sea Grant to study MPAs in Puget Sound, the southern half of the Salish Sea. And we found basically in doing hundreds of surveys with people all over Puget Sound that by and large, even recreational fishers support the declaration of no-take areas in Puget Sound. However, the tribes were concerned about erosion of their treaty rights for fisheries. And they said to us, we are not, and there's a legal statement by the Northwest Indians Fisheries Commission stating we're not necessarily against protected area, but the process by which these are being called for does not respect our treaty rights, is not inclusive, And therefore, we are quite skeptical. We're also concerned about the science of these because many of the resources we're trying to protect migrate, like salmon. And we're not sure that a small community, small MPA is going to really address many of our concerns. I'm really thankful to Terry Williams. Miss the man. I'm sure many of us do. And he said, well, Patrick, maybe you studying just MPAs isn't exactly aligned with what we want to do, but I'll invite you to come and study Quileute, the massive restoration project that the Tulalip tribes invested 20 years of time in and $10 million of their own resources as well as federal dollars. And basically, I remember maybe Brad, I think you were in the car ride with Terry where he said things like, you white guys are pretty funny because you protect these areas and want them to become pristine, and then you trash everything outside of it. That's not how we view the world. We want to be in right relationship and sustainable relationship. And Francesca, I really thank you so much for opening a lot of doors as well. And so that we pivoted towards looking at tribally led restoration, estuary restoration, like up at Quileute, up near Marysville and the Tulalip Tribes Reservation, as well as I'm doing some work down in Billy Frank Jr. Reserve down near Nisqually or in Nisqually. And this paper sort of signals what happened in the MPA conversation in Puget Sound. Basically, the process was not respectful towards inherent rights of the tribes and most specifically their treaty rights. And this paper kind of documents that transition, as well as the leadership of the tribes around large-scale estuary restoration. This other paper is about governance, and I'm going to talk a little bit about mega marine protected areas, which is basically how environmental NGOs are attaining these 30 by 30 goals, which is declaration of huge areas of remote ocean, areas over 150,000 square kilometers, things like Papahanaumokuakea out in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And we hosted a meeting studying the human dimensions of this. I'll talk about that in a bit. Here. 7 years ago, when I had the privilege of a sabbatical, I worked with Aulani Wilhelm, who's Native Hawaiian, as well as the director of the Marine Program for Conservation International. She was the underpinning guiding light for Papahanaumokuakea as the monument superintendent, but she was quite concerned by the behavior of some organizations, notably the Pew Charitable Trusts, in trying to shove down the throats of many people around the world these massive MPA declarations. I'm speaking very bluntly here, obviously. Aulani doesn't take things laying down. And she said, let's host a meeting, Patrick, pull together a bunch of people, advocates for these mega reserves and people who are staunch opposers. And a lot of people are quite upset with Pew and other NGOs in this area. And let's have a difficult dialogue. This one meeting for 2 days took us 6 months to prepare for. I had to cajole a lot of people. We had to pull together funding. We had this difficult dialogue, and we subsequently published this in other papers like that Code of Conduct paper. And I hope you can see some of the terms here. I can send out this PDF, but basically these are some of the things that came out of that difficult dialogue about people and their relations to these large reserves. Again, even the people who were opponents at the end of this meeting said, okay, as long as this is the rules of the road, we're not opposed to this. The people who are blind advocates for this said at the end of the time, okay, we understand maybe we need to change our ways. Things like best practices like integration of culture and traditions are really important. Local protocols need to be followed. We need to recognize different forms of knowledge. We need to identify the fact that there are both positive and negative effects on peoples with these declarations. We need to have people who can speak the local language involved in these processes. We have to recognize that there are mismatches in timeframes between different social groups, et cetera. We also need to have effective and engaging stakeholder processes where there's clear roles for different social groups. We need to have perhaps a steering committee and a management board really guiding these principles, almost like a board of directors, as opposed to an NGO advocating hard behind closed doors. We need to have and meet deadlines. We also need to maintain and be attentive to livelihoods. We have to understand that many of these livelihoods are place-based, and many of the people who are advocates for these mega marine reserves live in Washington, D.C. They don't live in Hawaii or in Papua New Guinea or other places. They're calling these shots from DC, and they're not attentive to the local impacts. We also need to look at the trade-offs. And I'll just say this, I'm not saying this in a prideful way, but subsequently I was invited to give a webinar at NOAA headquarters. And I invited people from Pew to come, many who were a bit nervous about this meeting. And I was worried that during the talk, they were going to sort of troll me and say, well, that meeting was horrible. Why did we go? Blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the meeting, they raised their hand. One guy from Pew raised his hand. He said, you know, Patrick, I just want to say that that meeting was really difficult. We don't usually expose ourselves to those kind of critiques. And that meeting changed how we work fundamentally. We're no longer trying to convince people of this. We're trying to find a way to work in partnership with people. Alani and the head of that program at Pew now are colleagues together working. Sometimes it's a fraught relationship, but at least they're in a relationship. So theme 2, interdisciplinary science and knowledge creation. Again, going back to some old good papers published in Science, but this is about risk management, in particular in relation to public policy and the environment. And I just want to hearken out that people have been calling for deep engagement with groups of people in many fora for quite a while. And this paper basically talks about in risk management, these are the kinds of things, but at the center of this diagram was engagement, full, deep engagement. Now, this messy slide is, I was asked by the Puget Sound Partnership to answer or look at the question of why is there investment of tens of millions of dollars in science in Puget Sound not having the desired impact on policy? So they gave me a contract to study the scientific community. This is what's called a social network analysis diagram. Think of it as like a communications food web. Each dot here is a person, an informant. Each one of these people, each one of these dots is a self-described scientist who is committed to the restoration of Puget Sound. Okay? We interviewed them, hundreds of them, and asked them to self-describe their PhD discipline, where they went to school, who they communicate with. In particular, they could nominate up to 10 people who they regularly communicate with around Puget Sound restoration. This program called UCINet then creates this web where who communicates to whom is closer in this diagram. And the dots get bigger when more people nominate a certain person. So those are opinion leaders. We can also code it by their disciplinary training, natural scientist, social scientist, or interdisciplinist. I want to ask you, who's red? Or what kind of disciplinist is red? Does anyone want to venture a guess? Is it a natural scientist, a social scientist, or an interdisciplinist? Anyone want to offer? Who's red? What is red? Well, I'm going to spoil the surprise here. Those are natural scientists. Those are ecologists. The blue dots represent social scientists talking to themselves up in the corner. Now, my point being here is that now this has changed. We're now 10 years past there, and the Puget Sound Partnership is now using this to create a working group on social sciences and more integration of sciences in Puget Sound, but we have a long way to go. I'm not dissing ecologists. I am half ecologist. I study fish. I used to teach ichthyology. I study limnology. However, if we really want to have balanced policies that are social and ecological both, we need to up our game on both sides equitably. I've also said things sometimes that have upset people, like I was a keynote speaker at something called the International Coral Reef Symposium. I said, you know what, half of future research funding should go to social science in the coral reef conservation realm. Gasp in the room, because almost all the funding goes to ecology. And I just think that we're only studying half the problem, especially since these are human-driven systems. Some people have also said to me, well, I had a reporter once say to me, I don't go to a social scientist to interview them from newspaper articles that I write for the New York Times. I ask ecologists because I don't understand the ecology of these systems, but I'm a person and I know more or less how people behave. So I didn't need to talk to an anthropologist or sociologist or a political scientist. And I'm just like, wow, really? Now, here's a slide that just says, here's the kind of bins in sort of universities of the different disciplines: social science, natural science, physical science. But commonly what we forget, and I'm always an advocate for integration and deep interdisciplinary work, I also just want to say that we frequently forget this, which is, you know, what are people, I've done thousands of interviews, and if you ask a fisher what motivates their lives, yeah, it's partly about fish and the biology and economics. But you know what's really important to a lot of people in the world? Love, pride, respect, inspiration. And this is what humanists measure and understand and inspire. So not only do we have to think about scientific disciplines, we need to think about the humanities. And I think this also is an opportunity for obvious linkages with indigenous worldviews in what matters in the world and how information is relayed and represented. I also think, again, the pragmatism, he says, this leads to better action and people's opinions changing and people not retreating into climate grief, but engaging in the real problems we face. So how does this happen in the real world? Again, I'm going to go back to the area that's safe to me, which is studying protected areas. I was asked to write a review paper by Nick Pullinan about this a while back. Again, this is a little dated, but it's still, I think, relevant. I looked across kind of the conversations and MPAs, and I published this paper in the journal. And basically, unfortunately, my conclusion about 10 years ago was there's not a lot of deep interdisciplinary work going on around protected areas, that there are disciplinary cultures that are a barrier. There's distinct methodological norms, the fetishization of quantification. And I'm using that provocatively. Number counting matters, but is not going to capture all the complexities of the world. There are distinct definitions of what is the environment. Like, are we part of nature? Are we separate from nature? Anthropologists have spent 100 years talking about that, as well as indigenous people advocate forcefully that we are always part of nature, by definition. What are the priority issues? In a fancy term, epistemic communities, which is a sociologic term for the sort of echo chamber, people working with, talking to, and relaying to only, hey, Carl, relaying only to, people that agree with them. And you can see that in the protected area world, where largely the people who agree that MPAs are the solution to most things on the ocean mostly talk to each other. And they don't talk to those people that we force them to talk to in the difficult dialogue in Hawaii. That's problematic, in my opinion. The term epistemic community was, by the way, coined when they looked at the Mediterranean and the future of the Mediterranean. Basically, a guy wrote a famous book about this and said, the people who want to say the Mediterranean have a certain view and they only talk to each other. But it also goes beyond it's a phenomenon that people exhibit even in our politics today, obviously, with echo chamber behavior. The recommendations from this paper were: consider your worldview and how they shape science and policy. Multidisciplinary research teams led by individuals with multidisciplinary stance and appreciation for other disciplines are really important. They need to be good listeners. There's a whole literature on who leads multidisciplinary programs. well. And it tends to be people who are good listeners and they're not invested in their own discipline blindly. Also, the balance of the global with the local scale and research design. The commitment to praxis, this idea that you link explicitly research to action. And then reforming funding in graduate education. You know, as an academic, I'm always banging the drum about how we need to train our grad students differently. One thing I just want to point out here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about worldview. I don't let my students go to Wikipedia, but I like to use it for terminology definitions. And so worldview is a term that we throw around quite a bit, but really what it is, it has a deep social science sort of history, which is largely about the fact that we look through the world as people, as primates, with lenses, a cognitive lens that basically filters information and shapes our belief systems. It is our worldview. It's a coherent understanding of the nature of reality. It permits holders to interpret new information. And this is where the rubber hits the road. Clashes among worldviews cannot be ended by a simple appeal to facts. In the climate change realm, in which you guys are all engaged in so deeply, and we're all engaged in so deeply, there was a naive belief that if we just got the science right and told people the truth of the matter, that they would change their behavior. I just was listening to an NPR broadcast about this, where he says, boy, 20 years ago, if we had really invested in psychological research around climate change, we'd probably be a lot further along now, because we would have recognized that there's reasons why some people deny it, as well as policies could be put in place that meet people at where they're at. The old adage in therapy, meet people where they're at. Social psychologists in Columbia University have now studied this empirically and said the best way is not to bury people with data, is to figure out what's the relation with the climate? How is a change going to affect them personally? And then where can we find common ground? Not to like convince them with our science. Now, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but every class, every year I teach a ecological society in the oceans. Hundreds of undergrads take it at UW. And basically we do a worldviews exercise around scarcity and resources, and then knowledge and what kind of knowledge you prefer. And all I want to point out here is that up in the right top is the Malthusian worldview. Resources are super limited and population is the driver of all environmental change. Cornucopianists in the bottom are people who think that resources are endlessly abundant and we need more people on the planet. On the x-axis, you have holistic thinkers on the right and then reductive thinkers on the left. And basically the engineering types. We do a social survey developed by Thomas Gladwin, a social psychologist. We do a fun role play, making fun of each other in these different worldviews, and then people score themselves. And what you see from these data, based on multiple years, is that students who take courses in environmental studies at the UW are mostly holistic neo-Malthusianists. However, there's also spread in the data. There are people who like to think in reductive ways. And there are people in the B school, for example, the business school, who don't buy the rhetoric of neo-Malthusianism. My point being here is that when I'm a teacher, I have to create a workspace, an educational space in which all people respect one another. I also tell them, if you want to be an effective manager, you need to understand where you are in this plot. And you need to accept the fact that you're going to be working with people who don't align with your worldview. So one thing I just want to say, and this is a really great book, a classic, a lot of good social science came out in the 60s. Berger and Luckman in 66 wrote a whole book about social construction of reality. Basically, their sort of thesis was worldview, shared opinions, are influenced by our education, our class, our gender, our race, and it's coded in language, politics, and religion. They talk very forcefully about the ideologizing implications, or the tendency for humans to believe that their worldview is the right one and that they have the right to impose it on other people. That's what ideology is. And it exists in the conservation movement. It also has been responsible for the death of millions of people in the world, in some instances, in the worst, most pernicious situations. I advocate for reading nature as a text and to be interpreted. It's influenced by our worldview. We need to understand our worldview and how it relates to the people we're trying to work with. It's not to deny the fact that an ocean or a coral reef exists. I would also say one thing is this, that an MPA is a policy. We manage people. We don't manage fish. The fish will take care of themselves. We manage people. We give incentives. And I'd also suggest that the ocean is a social construct. The meaning of the ocean, why we want to protect it, is completely derivative of who we are and our culture. So I always tell my students, look, if you jump in the ocean, you're going to get wet. I'm not denying the existence of the ocean and its physical attributes. I'm just saying that what the meaning of the ocean is very different to one another, to different people. There's a great book about this, The Social Construction of the Ocean by a geographer, Philip Steinberg. Really great read, really fun, captures the history of the oceans over millennia. Good book. So I just want to, I'm getting toward the end here. I just want to say I've been an advocate for this kind of deep applied social sciences. Most recently publishing a paper about what's referred to now in the global South, and particularly Latin America, but there's also some authors here from Hawaii, some Native Hawaiians, about social oceanography, and that the colonial legacies of, or history, the colonial roots of oceanography have not been acknowledged enough. And that in the global South, where many people are trained as oceanographers, they want to engage in things like environmental justice. And they're advocating for making space for that within the discipline of oceanography. There's also other articles here about conservation, social science, and the like. I just want to, and this is not meant to be an advocacy for social science, but I want to try to say that there are many important disciplines that are relevant to climate change and the environment: economics, history, psychology, the applied social sciences, of which I'm a part, law, education, communication. There's also the humanities, and they can address and work with you to understand all of these things on the right side, which are very relevant to the kind of questions you guys are dealing with. The socioeconomics, the governance, the norms, communication, values, etc., all these things. And I'm really a strong advocate for like robust work in this realm, not just anecdotal, relying on our sort of assumptions. Social scientists can work at different levels. We can look at the global level and look at global topics. We can look at the national or subnational levels, at legal frameworks, as well as we can look at the local level. One of the anecdotes I'll pass on is this. Here's another little quippy thing. I work a lot on parrotfish or conserving parrotfish on coral reefs, right? Well, parrotfish exist in both Southeast Asia as well as in the Caribbean, and they occupy more or less the same ecological niche. But the meaning of a parrotfish is hyper-localized, and how to conserve it is hyper-localized. So a lot of times people come and say, well, tell me the 5 things I need to pay attention to save the oceans, Patrick, from a social science perspective. And my response always is, it depends where we are talking. This is the difference between biophysical systems and social systems, where everything is hyper-localized. The coral triangle is the so-called Amazon of the ocean, right? This is the most biodiverse place on the planet, both if you consider terrestrial as well as marine systems. It is highly populated. It is where people rely on marine resources extensively for food and other things as well. The US government, in the most ambitious marine conservation program ever, spent $55 million over 5 years to bring together these countries to address issues around sustainability of fisheries, adaptation to climate change, and protection of biodiversity. One of the things in that $55 million grant from USAID, our taxpayers' money, was the development of a learning network. And a lot of people critiqued the establishment of this learning network called the Regional Exchange Program, which spent $5 million. People were like, well, this is just a bunch of junkets, people going to Jakarta to shop for bags, people hanging out, having a good time in fancy hotels. You know, this program brought together mid-level government people for 5 years. They had regular communications between meetings, frequently with WhatsApp and the like. They shared lessons and best practices around fisheries and protected areas and climate change adaptation. There was expert support, but it was not an expert-led program but it was, managers are a form of expertise, of course. And the goal, and I'll talk a little bit about this, ultimately was maybe thinking about a coral triangle-wide MPA system as well as monitoring system. Like I said earlier, many people critique this as just a waste of taxpayer money and show us the proof. Well, I was asked to do an end of project evaluation for the CTI program. We hired 25 people. We did 2,000 surveys. I personally did 150 interviews, and we did yet another social network analysis, studying these so-called REXs. This social network analysis is coded by country participating in this program. And this program over 5 years fostered a lot of communication. It also fostered leadership creation. So again, some of those bubbles are getting bigger. These are the opinion leaders. I don't have the time to talk about this, but it also even changed how gender relations exhibited in places like Papua New Guinea, which is a very misogynistic culture, very dangerous place for many women. And women in PNG and in the Solomons began to communicate with Filipinas about workplace dynamics, how to be a leader in the government. Take-home message here, a lot of communication were fostered within country as well as between country. We published a couple papers, as we like to do as academics, about this. But here's, again, where the rubber hits the road. Has what you learned at the REX ever influenced you to take an action in your country? 3/4 of the people, yes. I give a lot of credit to the regional program and exposed me to a lot of issues and concepts. I learned there's a whole range of issues out there not yet considered at the national level. And I've talked about this with Brad a little bit. I think what you guys are engaged in is maybe you don't formally discuss it or describe it as a learning network, but these kind of seminars and this ongoing touches between you guys is some form of a learning network. It's so important. It's not just anecdotal, it's essential to best practice development. And so basically, when we presented these data and this analysis back to USAID, et cetera, I would suggest that at the end of this program, there was the declaration of an MPA system across the 7 countries in which all of the countries were committed. There was profound discussion about the location of these different MPAs and their participation in an international system of MPAs. And I would just say this in conclusion, that MPA system wouldn't have existed without the investment of the $5 million and having people come together and talk about their future. It wasn't about scientists convincing them, although they brought science into the discourse. I then had a group of media, school of environmental affairs students and others study MPA, or not MPA, study learning networks, marine-based learning networks throughout the world. And this is really interesting. There's a growing movement toward this under the Trump administration when a lot of NOAA's work was eviscerated. And NOAA pushed a lot of money towards learning networks internationally because their hands were shackled. So they spent money supporting learning networks. Here's a list of various learning networks. The grad students and I conducted interviews of all the participants in all these learning networks that were, some are global, some are Caribbean, some are Latin America. And again, I don't have time to go into all the details. We did a very detailed qualitative analysis of many dozens of interviews, not hundreds. But here are some of the take homes. Here's what these networks do. They develop capacity. They develop mentorship and leadership. They foster learning exchanges between people on site. They foster meetings and knowledge exchanges around marine governance. They send people to major marine-related conferences to talk about what they're learning from each other. They support scientific and monitoring and evidence gathering, and they foster in the collaboration of publications and policy briefs and the like. And so these learning networks sometimes are government people, sometimes they're NGOs, sometimes they're activists, all different forms. But the sort of bottom line is that they're long-term commitments to people learning, peer-to-peer learning. We then also, this is some of the publications from the CTI work that we did, but also other ones as well. In Brazil, for example, they use learning networks to bring fisher folks to Brasilia in a systematic way to lobby legislators. And they've been doing that for years. That's a pretty interesting idea. A lot of learning networks are emerging now in the agroforestry realm. There's lots of interesting work in this. And I think, so I'd like to just conclude there. And I thank you so much. I'll give a little pitch, and maybe if there's like later on, if there's some interest, I'm doing a lot of work on digital storytelling with Chief Leschi School students and Jessica on this call, and creating videos around indigeneity and the links between UW students and Chief Leschi School students. But I just want to say that it's been a really fun collaboration and has drawn me into sort of the humanities side of this work. And we're now applying for some money. We have a grant from Earth Lab, but we're also applying, interestingly enough, to USGS to do food forest work on food sovereignty involving UW students and Chief Leschi students, as well as various land trusts to work on food forest reestablishment in estuaries. And all I want to just say is that maybe from the work and the inspiration of people like Francesca and Terry and others, I'm at a really steep and really fundamentally enjoyable learning curve. And I think a lot of my grad students like Jessica and others are really getting their minds blown about these kind of collaborations. So anyway, thank you so much.